So there are so many reasons why you wouldn't want to use an LLM to write a scientific article for you. Not only would that be super unethical, but why would you want an algorithm to take the driver's seat of your work? Why would you want something else to speak for you or to think for you? But what if you could turn an LLM from a writer into an editor? That's something worth exploring. So before we get started today, I think it's really important to just stop and consider, what is the job of an editor? If you think about the role of a writer versus an editor, it's not the editor's job to make the first rough draft. It's not the editor's job to outline your ideas for you. It's not the editor's job to do the thinking for you. That's completely for the writer to do. The writer's job is to organize their thoughts and to express those thoughts in writing, but it's really the editor who reads that and tries to figure out, well, how could this be better explained? Where could there be improvements? What is missing? It's really the editor's job to kind of clarify the writing, or at the very least, to make the writer aware that there are things that need to be changed or things that can be improved. So when you're starting to use AI to help with your writing, to assist with your writing, I think it's really important that you make some very conscious decisions to make sure that you are actually in charge of what is being said and what you're actually expressing. One of the first things that you really need to decide for yourself is, how much of the writing are you actually willing to offload onto the AI? If you're going to work with the AI in a centaur kind of way, where you are actually delegating some of the writing to an AI, you need to make a decision of what you're willing to give up. If it's a piece of writing that doesn't really matter, if it's a piece of writing that you're not actually taking credit for, maybe it's okay to fully offload the writing to an AI. But you really have to understand that the more you offload onto AI, the less control you have of those ideas and the less control you have of the writing itself. The other thing that I'll mention is that if you have a particular goal in mind, if there's like a website you want to post on, or a blog, or it's a scientific journal that you want to publish to, it's always a good idea just to check in to see what their AI policies are. You always want to adhere to those policies, and you just want to make sure that you're not violating any of those policies. So regardless of how comfortable you are offloading writing onto AI, I do think that there is a basic principle that you should follow, whether or not you're using AI at all or you're using AI a whole bunch, and that's to lead the conversation, don't follow it. What I mean by that is, you should take every opportunity possible to make sure that it's your thoughts first, that it's your ideas first, that you are the one who is actually guiding the conversation. And I really think that it's important that you are in control of the conversation, especially if you're dealing with a relationship that is like a human to machine conversation. You should be in control as much as possible. And so let's talk about what could potentially happen if you are not leading the conversation. And there is a whole bunch of negatives that could come from this, but there are three major ones that come to mind. The first one is, if you don't start off the conversation, if you don't start off with the ideas, if you don't start off with an outline, and you're basically asking ChatGPT or Gemini to generate things for you, you run the risk of creating this echo chamber. If you don't bring your own ideas to the table, a lot of times what can happen is ChatGPT or Gemini will bring in its own ideas that it's gleaned from its data sets and from its engineers and its programmers, and that could potentially influence you in how you think. So if you're at all worried about the effect that AI can have on human creativity and human output, it's really important that you don't allow computers to corrupt your thoughts. We want to be able to use computers to help us clarify our thoughts, to help us broaden our thoughts. But that really means that we need to put our own ideas and thoughts first. The other thing that you kind of want to avoid is just bias in the data set. And so let's be real. Humans are biased. Humans are always going to bring in their own biases. But just because you use a computer doesn't mean you get rid of bias. Just think about the data sets that are fed into those large language models. Think about all the fine tuning that engineers have to do to get that model to behave the way that it behaves. Those all have the potential to include the bias of the data sets and the engineers. And by leading the conversation, sure, you could introduce your own biases, but that's at least something that you are aware of and something that you can take responsibility for and try to minimize as much as possible. All right, so here's the last one. And this is really related to everything that we've been talking about before. If you are the primary contributor to the chat, then that means that most of what's going to come out is you. And that also puts you in a position where you can be very focused on whether or not you agree or disagree with what the chatbot gives back to you. Remember, the chatbot is going to try to give you text that makes sense to make you as happy as possible with the chatbot. And you want to make sure that you have formed as many of your thoughts as possible before you start allowing the chatbot to influence your ideas and your thoughts while you're making your products. So today I'm going to show you 2 different ways that you can use the chatbot to help with the writing. In both cases, we're going to be doing very similar things, but in one case, I'm going to start off with an outline that I've generated that I'm going to use Gemini to help me improve. And then I'm going to do a little bit of writing and then actually ask Gemini to help me with the writing itself. Now, if you are completely comfortable with the writing process and you don't need help with your outlining, you could skip that first step and jump into the second phase. But in case you're not super comfortable with your writing, this can be very, very helpful. So I've decided, what if I wanted to write a review article on that puncture research that I showed you last time? Why don't I start off with just a very, very simple outline of the ideas that I think are the most important and write a single paragraph in an introduction to this field. So let me do that. Let me open up Gemini over here, and I'm going to ask Gemini to do a couple things, right? Let's just give it a couple of instructions first. I want to write a paragraph for a scientific article. This will be in the introduction and will be used to introduce readers to my main point regarding puncture dynamics, which is just like the speed at which this happens, and tool shape. I have the following outline. Can you think of anything that this is missing? And so I really like this kind of a prompt where you just straight up go, here's what I have. Am I missing anything? Because right there, you're giving the chatbot instructions to say, don't just start pulling from your own stuff, right? Actually look at what I wrote, try to figure out the ideas that I have in my writing, and then give me some suggestions on what I could potentially add, and then maybe even like explain to me why that's helpful. In a separate document, I actually went and I wrote out a couple of bullet points. So you can see here, it doesn't even have to be formatted all that neatly. I just have a couple of statements saying biological tools for puncturing soft tissues are generally thought of as needing to be sharp. Sharp tools allow input energy to be focused into a concentrated point, right? That's like why something that's pointy can puncture better, because you're taking all that energy and you're really condensing and focusing it onto a singular point. But there are situations in which the shape of the tool matters less, right? Here, I know that I want to input an analogy to make this understandable. I don't really know what that analogy is just yet, but this is sort of like a placeholder. And then finally, I'm ending with my main point. It's important to take into account dynamics when studying puncture of biological systems. So that is my outline. I came up with that myself. And now let's see what Gemini has to say in terms of if it's missing anything. Okay, so Gemini is very polite, says this is a solid foundation for an intro paragraph, but there are a couple of things that I could do here, right? I could define sharp more precisely, right? Add a bullet point there to really talk about what does sharp actually mean. It's not a bad idea. I could briefly mention why biological systems are often punctured. This is a thing that I know I used to get feedback all the time from my advisor saying, what is the biological relevance of this? Why would a biologist care about this? And so I could add a bullet point talking about why systems are punctured and why it actually matters in terms of feeding, defense, locomotion, etc., etc. As you can see, these are all some pretty good points. I'm probably more interested in this one, giving some biological relevance to this problem, maybe even defining what sharp is. These first 2 bullet points are actually really good things that I want to add to my outline. And what you'll see is Gemini even went ahead and revised my outline for me. Here's the introduction to biological puncture. We need to define what sharpness is and also potentially the function of sharpness. So these are changes that I initially didn't have in my outline, but after seeing how they fit in here, I can make the decision, yes, I agree with this, or no, I don't agree with this. I think these are actually very, very good additions, and I wasn't really thinking about this, so I will keep these 2 bullet points in, or I'll work that into my outline a little bit more. I don't think at this point it is necessary to keep a lot of the other stuff. But check this out. Remember how I had a placeholder for the analogy? Insert analogy here makes it easy to understand. For example, high-speed projectile versus a needle penetrating a deformable material. So this is something that I do want help from in terms of an editor, right? So if I actually had a human research partner working with me in the lab, I might have them read a couple of sentences or describe what I'm trying to get at, and then ask, can you help me brainstorm an analogy that would work well here? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add these 2 bullet points to my own outline because I do think they're important. And then I'm going to work a little bit more with the chatbot to try to hone in on a good analogy to replace in that placeholder. So I want to work with Gemini a little bit more to try to find a suitable analogy here, right? And so I have updated my outline. I would like help trying to figure out a good analogy that a broad audience would understand. Here is my revised outline. And so here's my revised outline. You'll see that it's mostly the same. We have biological tools for puncturing soft tissues are generally thought of as needing to be sharp. And here I have a definition of what sharp is, right? Having a relatively small tip of the tool in relationship to the structure being punctured. That's what sharpness is in my case. And what I've noted here is that it's common in both predators that need to hunt, for example, having sharp talons, and also in prey that need to defend themselves, right? Like prickly cactus, right? The cactus needles. And so again, that was with the help of defining sharpness and function of sharpness that Gemini suggested to me. But now we've given it this extra instruction, right? I really would like help to try to find a good analogy for this. So let's see if Gemini can help me with a good analogy. So here are a few analogies, right? A water balloon, a high-speed train versus a brick wall. That's interesting. Focus on mass momentum and overcoming resistance. I think this is the winner. The bullet versus a blunt object, right? So here's the analogy that it gave. Of course, I want to simplify this because this is way too long. So if we're thinking about a bullet is pretty tapered at the end to have a nice fine tip. You could consider that to be pretty sharp. And that has the potential to puncture whatever it's being shot at. But also a blunt object, even though it wouldn't penetrate nearly as effectively, if you did it at high enough speed, if you did it with high enough velocity, then the energy transfer becomes paramount, often more so than the sharpness of the leading edge. So this is just setting up this really cool idea that, like, sure, you could be sharp and that helps, but even if you're not sharp, if you're fast enough, if you have high enough velocity, you could still potentially do what you needed to do, which is puncture or break things. So I actually like this. I'm actually going to try to incorporate this analogy into this bullet point, and then we'll ask Gemini for help one more time. Okay, so I made a couple of modifications, right? Instead of using a bullet versus a blunt object, I thought that was a good start, but it didn't really work when I was writing my outline. So here's my new outline. So in this case, here's my analogy, right? Some projectiles like bullets have a tapered end and are relatively sharp, right? So, bullets go at high speeds. They can be tapered. They can introduce a little point. So sure, you have some projectiles that are sharp, but not all projectiles are sharp. I was just sitting here thinking, what about cannonballs, right? What about things that are propelled using catapults? Those aren't necessarily sharp, but what happens is they are able to still transfer enough energy to puncture their target anyway, despite their lack of sharpness or despite their shape. And so I think this is really interesting. It's not exactly what Gemini was getting at, but it puts it into the minds of the reader that, like, oh yeah, shape can be important, but maybe there are other things aside from shape that can really determine how something is going to work as a projectile or as a puncturing entity. So I think this exercise is really interesting because it shows you this iterative process of, here are my ideas, here are some suggestions from the AI, and then I either accept those ideas, I reject those ideas, or I modify those ideas. If you can maintain that kind of relationship with a chatbot as you are doing your writing or as you're doing your brainstorming, that really does keep you in charge. There's this phrase that a lot of AI engineers use, that if you allow the chatbots to do a lot of the thinking for you, you could potentially fall asleep behind the wheel. And so making sure that you are actually a active participant in this conversation makes that less likely. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with my outline. I think Gemini is also given me some ideas, but I've hit the wall in terms of getting useful feedback at this point. But this is a really good starting point to actually turn this outline into writing. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to work on writing this, and then we're going to do kind of a similar thing, but instead of using bullet points, we're going to have AI look at our writing. So give me a second to write a paragraph. So after working on this paragraph a little bit, let me just show you what this looks like. Right. I took all of the input that Gemini gave to me. I actually modified my outline a little bit as I was writing it because it just felt a little bit better to write it this way. But let me show you my introductory paragraph. When we think about the tools that biological organisms use to puncture soft material, we usually associate these tools with being sharp. Whether we consider the talons of a hawk used for predation or the pokey spines cacti use as a defense, having a relatively small tip at the end of the tool, i.e. sharpness, is generally associated with puncturing ability. But there are some systems in which the sharpness of the tool is less important. For example, although the shape of a cannonball lacks sharp, pointy edges, it is more than capable of puncturing a wall if it is propelled at sufficient speed. This simple example hints at the dynamics of a system. How much and how quickly energy is transferred can determine the importance of tool shape. In this study, we review multiple biological systems at a range of speeds to demonstrate the importance of dynamics when studying puncture. So again, I modified a little bit of how the analogy was going to fit in here, but I'm generally happy with this paragraph. And again, AI has not touched this. This is me writing from my own AI modified outline. This is me not falling asleep behind the wheel. This is me actually taking my ideas and expressing them as sentences and paragraphs. Okay, so let's get a little bit of feedback here, right? We don't want to end here because there's always room for improvement, right? So let's think about a prompt that we can give Gemini. I've written the following paragraph for the introduction. And again, you can like use your own prompts or you can modify this your own way. But I always like starting off with like, what are the pros and cons of what I have so far? So let's just start off with, what are the strengths of this paragraph? How could it be improved? So we're asking two different things. We're not trying to have the AI lie to us because we're giving it permission to say like, how can we improve this? We're also trying to have an idea of what does the large language model think about the strengths of this paragraph, and we can use that to calibrate our own strengths. Like I obviously think that this paragraph is pretty strong, and if there's good alignment between what I think and what the AI thinks, awesome. Or it might help me think about something else that I can add or how I can modify this in the future. But let's just see how the chatbot's going to respond. So strengths, clear opening, good biological examples with the hawk talon and the sharpness, good analogy, clear main point. All of this is good to me. I agree with this. I think these are all the strengths that I have of this introductory paragraph. But how could it be improved? Okay. So maybe my definition of sharpness isn't great, right? I actually just came up with that on my own. I didn't look into the literature to see how other people define sharpness. I just think of it as like a common word. But having a relatively small tip radius or acute angle at the end of the tool, sharpness. And like, here's the thing. I wouldn't just copy and paste what the AI has here. What this statement does to my mind is say, like, do I need to reconsider what sharpness means? Can I think of examples of sharpness that don't match what I already have in my paper? And maybe this actually has me go into the literature to figure out, well, how does the field use and describe the term sharpness? The point here is not to generate text that you can just copy and paste and replace wholesale. This is here to challenge what you think. It's to challenge your ideas. And it really to get you thinking, like, is this something I need to worry about, or is this something I need to expand a little bit more? What else do they say? Strengthening the less important statement. So here's my text. There are some systems in which the sharpness of the tool is less important. Okay, I think that's fine, but I can kind of see where the AI is going. So there's their suggestion. There are some systems in which the sharpness of a tool is markedly less important, particularly at high speeds. Okay, so again, kind of a good suggestion. I would not copy and paste this because I would never use the word markedly, for example. So instead of just saying there are some systems in which the sharpness of a tool is less important, maybe giving some parenthetical reference here or a comma, or expanding this with a clause to say in which systems is the sharpness of the tool less important. Obviously, the next couple of sentences really describe this, including the analogy of the cannonball, but it is a good idea to maybe consider. I'm going to leave it for now. I think as a first draft it's okay, but it's definitely something that has like put up flags in my head to kind of like look at later in the future. A couple of these I don't really agree with. So for example, in my cannonball analogy, Gemini says that it might be better to describe what it means to not be sharp. For example, blunt being round, lacking sharp pointy edges. To me, I don't think that is that important. To me, that's like making changes for the sake of making changes. So I disagree with that. I'm not going to ignore that. It doesn't really resonate with something that's important to me. Now, of course, Gemini is always going to try to write for you. It's always going to try to generate these things for you. So for example, I didn't ask for this, but Gemini went ahead and gave me some of its ideas and modified my text. I'm going to suggest that you don't look at this or you don't use this. I don't think that this is important. I think the most important thing is actually having these ideas of where you might think of things differently, where you might want to refine things, right? And it's actually up to you as the writer to do that. And again, like, that's why we're writing. That's why we're doing this scientific writing. It's to take these ideas that we've had and to express them into words, not only for our audience, but also for ourselves. Okay, I think I've modeled enough for you how I actually use chatbots to improve my writing. I hope I was able to demonstrate to you that I don't use large language models or chatbots to actually write for me. I actually use them to help me think, to help me improve my clarity of thought, to help me improve my own writing. And hopefully that's something that you can take with you moving forward, even outside of a scientific context. All right, so that's all I have for you in today's video. I hope that was useful, and I'll see you in the next video.